Good Friday fell on March 27th in 1964. Along the coast of south-central Alaska, the day passed quietly. In Valdez, Seward, Whittier, and Kodiak, families prepared for the evening. Children finished dinner. Boats sat tied along wooden piers, their hulls tapping gently against rubber fenders. The air was cold and still. Valdez Harbor held fishing vessels and cargo ships. The water lay flat beneath a gray sky. Snow covered the peaks of the Chugach Mountains. In town, store windows glowed yellow. The streets were empty except for occasional footsteps on packed snow. Wood smoke drifted from chimneys. In Seward, at the head of Resurrection Bay, fishing nets hung drying on the docks. The Standard Oil Tank Farm sat near the waterfront, its white cylinders rising above the timber warehouses. A train idled on tracks that ran parallel to the shore. The bay stretched south toward the Gulf of Alaska, its surface calm and dark. Whittier was smaller, a town built around a wartime port. Most residents lived in two large concrete buildings constructed during World War II. The harbor was narrow, surrounded by steep mountains. Ice floated near the shoreline. The wind came down through the valleys in cold gusts. Kodiak Island lay farther out to sea, its fishing fleet the heart of its economy. Canneries lined the waterfront. Boats crowded the docks. The town smelled of salt and diesel fuel. Lights blinked on as dusk arrived. At 5:36 in the evening, the ground began to move. It started as a low vibration, something felt more than heard. Floors shifted beneath feet. Dishes rattled in cupboards. People stopped what they were doing and looked around. Then the shaking grew stronger. Windows cracked, walls groaned. The motion was not side to side but rolling, rising and falling like the deck of a ship. Pictures fell. Furniture slid across rooms. Outside, telephone poles swayed. Power lines snapped. Trees bent unnaturally. The sound was deep and constant, a grinding rumble that came from below. The shaking did not stop. Seconds became a minute. People tried to move toward doorways or outside, but the floor bucked beneath them. Some crawled. Others held onto tables or crouched low. The earth continued to heave. In harbors, the water began to slosh. Boats yanked against their lines. Docks rose and fell. Pilings cracked. The motion was chaotic, the water surging in every direction at once. Waves collided in the middle of the harbor. Some boats broke loose. Others were crushed between pilings and debris. On land, the ground split. Cracks opened in streets. Pavement buckled. Buildings leaned. Some collapsed entirely, their frames snapping like kindling. Dust rose into the cold air. Glass shattered in every direction. The shaking lasted 4 minutes and 38 seconds. It was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North America, with a magnitude of 9.2. The rupture zone extended over 800 kilometers along the coast. In some places, the ground rose by 11 meters. In others, it dropped by more than 2. Entire sections of coastline changed elevation permanently. When the shaking finally stopped, the silence that followed was unnatural. No birds called. No engines ran. People stood in the wreckage, breathing hard, their ears ringing. Smoke rose from broken chimneys. Fires started in collapsed buildings. The sky was darker now. Then someone noticed the harbor. The water had pulled back. The rupture began 25 kilometers beneath Prince William Sound. The Pacific Plate, moving northwest at roughly 5 centimeters per year, had been pressing beneath the North American plate for centuries. Stress accumulated along the boundary. On the evening of March 27th, the fault gave way. The release was catastrophic. A 600-kilometer section of the plate boundary slipped suddenly. The overlying crust snapped upward in some areas and collapsed downward in others. The energy released was equivalent to thousands of nuclear warheads, though it dissipated through rock and water rather than air. The duration of the shaking was extraordinary. Most large earthquakes last between 30 and 90 seconds. This one continued for nearly 5 minutes. The ground moved in waves. People described it as feeling like standing on gelatin. Structures designed to withstand brief jolts could not endure the prolonged motion. Foundations shifted, joints separated. Buildings that might have survived a shorter quake came apart slowly. In Anchorage, 120 kilometers from the epicenter, entire neighborhoods slid downhill. The Turnagain Heights area experienced a massive landslide triggered by soil liquefaction. Houses broke apart as the ground beneath them flowed like thick liquid. Fissures opened dozens of meters wide. Trees tilted at impossible angles. Roads disappeared. Closer to the epicenter, the damage was structural and immediate. In Valdez, the waterfront began to collapse during the shaking itself. The land beneath the docks was composed of loose sediment and glacial till. As the earthquake continued, this material lost cohesion. The entire waterfront delta started sliding into the bay. 31 people standing on the dock were carried into the water as the land disappeared beneath them. They vanished in seconds. In Seward, similar processes were underway. The waterfront was built on an unstable submarine slope. As the shaking intensified, the slope failed. A section of the harbor, including parts of the rail yard and oil storage facilities, slid underwater. The slide generated its own local wave, separate from the tsunami that would arrive later. This wave struck the remaining waterfront within moments, carrying debris and burning fuel. The standard oil tanks ruptured during the slide. Thousands of gallons of fuel spilled into the bay and ignited. Flames spread across the surface of the water. The combination of fire and wave created scenes that defied normal categories of disaster. Water that should extinguish fire instead carried it. The bay glowed orange in the failing light. Whittier's damage was compounded by its geography. The town sat in a narrow fjord, surrounded by mountains that focused and amplified the seismic waves. Buildings swayed so violently that some people were thrown to the ground repeatedly. The concrete towers that housed most of the population cracked but did not collapse. The smaller wooden structures near the waterfront fared worse. Several were shaken off their foundations. Kodiak Island, located farther from the epicenter, experienced less violent shaking, but the duration was still severe. Chimneys toppled. Windows broke. Boats in the harbor collided as the water surged unpredictably. Fishermen scrambled to secure their vessels, but the chaotic motion made this nearly impossible. Lines snapped. Hulls splintered against pilings. The earthquake altered the physical landscape permanently. Sections of coastline rose dramatically, leaving former tidal zones high and dry. Barnacles and seaweed, previously submerged, found themselves meters above the new waterline. In other areas, land subsided and forests drowned as seawater flooded in. Trees died standing, their roots in salt water. Railway tracks bent into waves. Roads developed offsets where one side of a crack had moved meters relative to the other. Bridges twisted. Tunnels collapsed. The Alaska Railroad sustained damage along its entire southern route. Communications infrastructure failed almost immediately. Phone lines were down. Radio antennas had toppled. For towns along the coast, isolation was total. As the ground finally stilled, survivors emerged into altered landscapes. Buildings leaned at angles. Streets were impassable. In some towns, fires burned unchecked because water mains had ruptured. The air smelled of dust and smoke and something sharper, a chemical odor from ruptured fuel lines and industrial facilities. But the earthquake was only the beginning. The vertical displacement of the seafloor had set something else in motion. Trillions of gallons of water had been pushed upward suddenly. The ocean surface, trying to return to equilibrium, began to move. In Valdez, the waterfront was gone. Where docks and warehouses had stood, there was now only dark water filled with debris. Survivors moved away from the shoreline, climbing toward higher ground. The air was extremely cold. Breath formed clouds. The mountains around the bay were silent and black against the evening sky. Then someone heard it, a sound like machinery running in the distance, a low, mechanical grinding that grew louder. It came from the bay. The wave arrived approximately 30 minutes after the earthquake ended. It did not look like a breaking wave. It was a rise in the entire surface of the water, a lifting of the bay itself. The darkness made it nearly impossible to see, but its approach was audible. The sound intensified, a deep rushing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The water climbed onto what remained of the shore. It moved fast but not in a dramatic curl. It simply rose and kept rising, pushing wreckage ahead of it. Pieces of the collapsed dock tumbled in the surge. The wave carried trees, sections of buildings, barrels, and sheets of metal. The debris field scraped and collided, producing a continuous crashing sound. Buildings still standing near the waterfront were struck. Water poured through broken windows and doors. Walls gave way under the pressure. Some structures were pushed off their foundations and carried inland. Others collapsed where they stood, folding inward as the wave passed through them. The water smelled of oil and mud and something organic, the disturbed bottom of the bay. It was freezing. Anyone caught in it would have had only minutes before hypothermia set in. The current was strong, pulling debris in complex patterns as the water sought the lowest routes inland. In Seward, the situation was compounded by fire. The fuel that had spilled during the submarine landslide was still burning when the tsunami arrived. The waves spread the flames across a wider area. Burning oil rode on top of the water, igniting structures as the surge advanced. The rail yard was inundated. Train cars were pushed off the tracks and tumbled into each other. Some were carried hundreds of meters from where they had been parked. The waterfront hotel, a 3-story wooden structure, was struck by the combination of water and fire. The wave lifted it partially off its foundation. Flames consumed the upper floors while water filled the lower levels. The building disintegrated within minutes, its pieces scattering across the flooded zone. The wave in Seward was not a single event. Multiple surges struck over the course of an hour. Each one rearranged the debris field. Water would retreat, pulling wreckage back toward the bay, then return with another surge. Survivors who had climbed to higher ground watched as the waterfront was systematically erased. Each wave left less standing than the one before. The cold was relentless. People who had fled their homes without coats stood shivering in small groups on the hillsides above town. They could see the fires burning below but could not reach them. The heat did not rise far enough to provide warmth. Instead, the fires simply marked the extent of the destruction, orange points in the darkness. In Whittier, the narrow fjord focused the tsunami's energy. The wave funneled up the inlet, gaining height as the water was compressed by the steep walls. When it struck the waterfront, it was traveling fast. Buildings were smashed immediately. The smaller structures near the docks vanished. Boats were thrown inland, some landing on top of collapsed buildings. The Hodge Building and the Buckner Building, the 2 large concrete towers, were struck at their lower levels. Water surged through the ground floors, filling stairwells and corridors. The force was enough to move vehicles parked nearby. A locomotive sitting on the tracks was shoved off the rails and toppled onto its side. Survivors trapped on upper floors of the Hodge Building could feel the structure shudder as the wave hit. Water reached the 2nd floor in some areas. The sound inside the building was overwhelming, a combination of rushing water and colliding debris. Windows blew out from the pressure. Furniture tumbled. The lights, which had flickered back on briefly after the earthquake, went out again. Kodiak received the tsunami later, giving residents slightly more time to react. Warnings had been attempted, but communication was difficult. Some people heard announcements on battery-powered radios. Others were alerted by sirens or simply by word of mouth. Many moved to higher ground. Some did not. The first wave reached Kodiak approximately 2 hours after the earthquake. It struck at low tide, which reduced its impact somewhat, but the surge was still substantial. The downtown waterfront was flooded. Canneries were damaged. Boats broke loose from moorings and collided. The fishing fleet, the town's economic lifeblood, suffered heavily. Vessels were driven ashore, smashed against buoy, or sunk in the harbor. Later waves were larger. Water pushed several blocks inland, flooding homes and businesses. The surges continued through the night, each one rearranging the wreckage. By morning, the waterfront district was unrecognizable. Seward's waterfront burned through the night. The fires, fed by ruptured fuel tanks and oil-soaked debris, spread in patches across the flooded area. The flames reflected off the water, creating a flickering orange light that illuminated the destruction. Smoke rose in thick columns, drifting inland on the cold wind. The Alaska Railroad's infrastructure in Seward was devastated. Train cars lay scattered across the rail yard, some on their sides, others crumpled. The tracks themselves were twisted into unusable shapes, the rails bent upward in places or buried under debris in others. Locomotives had been pushed hundreds of meters from their original positions. One engine sat in the ruins of a warehouse, its front half buried under collapsed timbers. The Standard Oil facility was largely destroyed. Of the several large storage tanks that had stood near the waterfront, most were either ruptured or missing entirely. The ones that remained intact were surrounded by debris fields. Thousands of gallons of fuel had been lost, either burned in the fires or washed out to sea. The air was thick with the smell of petroleum. Buildings that had survived the earthquake and the first wave often succumbed to later surges. Walls weakened by the initial impact collapsed when struck again. Structures filled with water became unstable, their foundations undermined. Wood swelled and warped. Metal twisted under repeated stress. Each surge added to the damage, systematically reducing what remained. In Valdez, the decision was eventually made to abandon the old town site entirely. The waterfront area was unsalvageable, and the ground itself was deemed unsafe. The slope that had failed during the earthquake could fail again. Over the following years, the entire community would relocate to a more stable location several kilometers away. The old town would be left to decay. Immediately after the disaster, however, survivors focused on the missing. 31 people had disappeared when the dock collapsed during the earthquake. Their bodies were not recovered. Families searched the wreckage, calling out names, but the cold and the darkness made organized efforts nearly impossible. Small groups moved through the ruins with flashlights, their beams cutting through the smoke. Whittier's damage was concentrated near the waterfront, but the impact on the small community was severe. The town had limited infrastructure to begin with, and much of it was destroyed. The dock facilities were gone. The rail connection was severed. The tunnel that provided the only land access to Whittier was blocked by rock falls triggered by the earthquake. The community was completely isolated. 13 people died in Whittier, most killed by the tsunami. Some were caught in collapsing buildings. Others were swept away by the water. The cold was a factor in several deaths. People pulled from the water often died from hypothermia before they could be warmed. Survivors gathered in the upper floors of the 2 concrete towers. The buildings, despite their damage, provided shelter from the wind. Families huddled together in stairwells and hallways, sharing blankets and whatever warm clothing could be found. Outside, the wind continued to gust down through the mountain passes, driving the temperature lower. Kodiak faced a slower unfolding disaster. The tsunami waves struck over many hours, each one pushing farther inland. The downtown area flooded repeatedly. Water reached depths of several meters in some streets. Vehicles were submerged. Ground floor businesses were destroyed. The canneries, essential to the island's economy, sustained heavy damage. The fishing fleet was devastated. Boats torn from their moorings collided with each other and with fixed structures. Hulls were punctured. Masts snapped. Engines flooded. Some vessels sank in the harbor. Others were driven onto shore and left stranded when the water receded. A few were carried so far inland that recovering them would require heavy equipment. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Fishing was not just an industry in Kodiak, it was the industry. The loss of boats meant the loss of livelihoods. Fishermen who had invested everything in their vessels found themselves without the means to work. Cannery workers faced similar uncertainty. The facilities that processed the catch were damaged or destroyed. In the hours after the tsunami, communication with the outside world remained nearly impossible. Radio operators tried to send messages, but most antennas were down. A few weak signals got through, alerting authorities in Anchorage and elsewhere that the coastal towns had been hit hard, but details were scarce. The extent of the damage, the number of casualties, the specific needs of each community, these facts would take days to establish. Fires continued to burn in Seward. Firefighting was impossible. The water mains were broken, and the fire trucks themselves were damaged or inaccessible. The flames consumed what remained of the waterfront, reducing wooden structures to ash and twisted metal. The heat was intense enough to warp steel beams and melt glass. As the night deepened, temperatures dropped further. Survivors without shelter faced the real possibility of freezing. Makeshift shelters were constructed from salvaged materials. People broke into buildings that were still standing, seeking refuge. Some climbed into vehicles, running engines intermittently to generate heat. Others simply walked, staying in motion to avoid hypothermia. The darkness was nearly absolute. Power was out across all affected towns. The few lights visible were from fires or from battery-powered flashlights and lanterns. The stars were obscured by smoke and clouds. The only sounds were the wind, the occasional crash of shifting debris, and the low murmur of voices as people called to each other in the ruins. Dawn came slowly on March 28th. A gray light spread across the coast, revealing the scale of the destruction. Fog drifted in from the water, mixing with smoke from fires that had not yet burned out. The air was cold and heavy. Even with limited visibility, the devastation was unmistakable. In Seward, the waterfront no longer resembled a working port. Where docks and warehouses had stood, there was now a broad field of wreckage stretching inland. Boats lay on their sides in the streets. Train cars were scattered in unnatural positions. Fragments of walls and roofing protruded from piles of debris. The rail yard was a tangled mass of twisted metal and splintered timber. The burned sections were the most surreal. Wooden structures had been reduced to ash. Machinery, engines, and rail tracks were warped and discolored. The smell of smoke hung over everything, mixed with the scent of the sea and spilled fuel. Survivors walked through the ruins in silence. Some searched for belongings. Others simply looked, trying to understand the scale of what had happened. The fog muffled sound, creating an eerie stillness. Footsteps cracked glass and fragments of wood. Occasionally, a voice called a name, but the fog swallowed the sound almost immediately. Valdez was worse. The waterfront district had been erased entirely by the earthquake, the submarine landslide, and the tsunami. The bay was filled with drifting debris. Buildings and docks floated in broken sections. Boats moved slowly among the wreckage. The surrounding mountains were silent, their snow-covered peaks barely visible through low clouds. The bodies of those lost when the dock collapsed were not recovered quickly. Cold water and depth made the search difficult. Families waited along the shore, some hoping, others already certain. Whittier focused on survival. The town was isolated, the tunnel blocked, the dock destroyed, and the harbor dangerous. Supplies were limited. Food and water were inventoried carefully. The two large concrete buildings that had remained intact became the center of community life. Outside, the debris field was chaotic. Buildings had collapsed into heaps of lumber and metal. Boats lay on top of ruined structures. The toppled locomotive rested near the shoreline, rail lines bent or buried beneath debris. Kodiak's morning revealed a transformed waterfront. The canneries central to the local economy were heavily damaged. Roofs were down. Walls had failed. Equipment lay ruined. Docks were shattered and pilings snapped at the waterline. Boats that had not sunk were scattered across the shore, some upright but far inland, others overturned or torn apart. Downtown streets were coated in mud, seaweed, and fragments of buildings. Vehicles sat where the water had left them, on sidewalks in intersections or pressed against storefronts. Windows were blown out. Merchandise and debris mixed in thick layers of silt. Rescue efforts began slowly. Helicopters from bases in Anchorage and Kodiak surveyed the region, identifying isolated communities and dropping supplies. Medical teams were flown in. Weather interfered constantly, fog and low clouds grounding flights for hours. In the following days, the scale of the disaster became clear. More than 130 people had died, most in the tsunami. Entire communities were destroyed or severely damaged. Roads, railways, docks, and power systems were wrecked across hundreds of miles. Economic losses were enormous. Yet the response also revealed resilience. Communities organized relief efforts. Neighbors helped one another. Supplies were shared. Valdez chose to relocate the entire town. Seward, Whittier, and Kodiak began planning long rebuilding processes that would take years. The 1964 Alaska earthquake and tsunami reshaped modern seismology. The event provided crucial data about subduction zone behavior and tsunami generation. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center was strengthened and expanded. New warning systems and updated building codes were adopted across the Pacific. Coastal communities began to view tsunami risk with new seriousness. For the people of Alaska, the disaster became a defining memory. Anniversaries are observed quietly. Memorials stand in rebuilt towns. The landscape still shows the scars: raised shorelines, drowned forests, abandoned sites slowly reclaimed by vegetation. The ocean, long a source of life, was understood differently after 1964. It remained essential, but it was also a force that could rise without warning and take everything away.